They are stories as old as time of beauty and longing, courtship, and of ghosts? Wait. Do I have the wrong... Oh, there you go. Stories of passion and lust and the supernatural? Okay, the truth is the genre of romance has taken on a whole new meaning. Yet, the flames she holds still burn, but the doors of perception may be closing in on what you may think of in a traditional sense as the genre of romance. But thanks to these storytellers...
I'm AJ Mullican. I write sci-fi romance, dystopian romance, and paranormal romance. A lot of that going on lately. And I'm glad to be here to talk on the show.
Hi everyone, I'm Karina Kantas. I'm the author of many books. Lots of romance in there. I also have the podcast and YouTube show Behind the Pen. I am the host of the radio show Author Assist, and I also run Author Assist, which helps authors with their marketing and promotion.
Hey, I'm Jennifer Soucy. I'm a horror author, but I also write some paranormal romance occasionally. And I also really love the romance genre, the more darker side of it. But yeah, I'm super glad to be here and talk about it.
Hi, I'm Sydnie Beaupre. I write paranormal romance, dystopian romance, and fantasy romance. And I'm really glad to be here.
Those rose petals may cover many layers, but we are still talking about the genre of romance. You know, the cool thing I want to start with about romance that I find interesting is that there's degrees and there's also different ways of romance, and there's different... You can pretty much incorporate romance into any genre. I mean, it's a versatile tool almost in that respect, but you have to be careful with it, right? Because there's a balancing act, because there's going over the line with romance, and there's also putting so much in it that you have to classify it almost as a romance, you know, and unless you're trying to do that. But you could do a horror book without calling it horror paranormal romance, right? But if you go a little bit too much, then you have to do like paranormal romance, right? But and there's marketing strategies to all of that, and it's you know, it helps a lot. And so I'm curious from your perspectives how you view when you're writing. Are you writing with the idea that I'm going to have this amount of romance, or I'm going to try and if romance happens, it's just a natural thing? Where do you all stand on how you begin this? Are you aiming for romance, or is it something that happens naturally within your process?
Well, with my dystopian sci-fi novels, the romance kind of just comes along with the show. The characters came along and they're like, hey, this is me, then I like this dude. And it's like, okay, sure. With the paranormal romance I've been writing, it's reverse harem. So yeah, I went in with the intention of romance because you got one chick and a bunch of guys. You got to kind of work it in. You know, so that was intentional. The sci-fi romance just kind of became a romance just out of happenstance of the way the characters interacted with each other.
Dystopian sci-fi erotica is exactly how I say it. It's a dystopian first, sci-fi second, and erotica third. So the romance does not take precedence, nor does the erotica. Basically, when they get together, the two characters, it's graphic, which makes it erotica. But I wanted to make sure that the dystopian sci-fi, the erotica didn't actually take over the book, that it's actually a dystopian sci-fi.
Basically, most of my books, I approached it with romance first, and then say romance sci-fi or romance paranormal. Yeah, the romance takes precedent over everything else, but it doesn't affect the story in a way that it's not over heavy-handed.
As for me, I mean, I write primarily horror stories, They sometimes go towards dark fantasy. I never go in except for my paranormal romance / horror. Obviously, I went in knowing that there was going to be a romance central to the plot. But for everything else, it just kind of happened. Like, you start writing and maybe your character meets this character and you don't realize until you get to a certain point, but you're like, okay, well, this is going to happen. So I guess I'm just going to work around it and let it happen. But it rarely becomes the focal point of my story, except occasionally it does. Like my Southern Gothic horror ghost story type thing. See, I always think of Southern Gothic as having a romance element. Now, it doesn't mean it's a good romance element. Like, it doesn't end happily, and it's often very tragic, but that's kind of, they're tied together for me. So when it happened in that, it felt very natural. So I just went with it and becomes part of the story. We do focus sometimes more on the expectations of the genre. And, if certain things happen, you work with it, but it doesn't necessarily become your focal point.
Let me ask this question, storytelling in general, because we know we're going to edit these. We know that we're going to ultimately bring these down. Is the romance the first element you look at when you're doing your editing as to what to cut? Is that something that you guys trim down more often than anything else?
Not me. But then I'm one who edits as I go. So a lot of the stuff that I pare down, I don't really know how much is one thing or another, because I'm kind of like, as I go along, like, oh wait, I don't like this paragraph or whatever, I find that I add more to the romance in editing sometimes. It seems like sometimes I'll flesh out a scene more once I'm going through it another time or two, more often than I will with other details, especially if I notice that it's leaning that direction.
I definitely agree with that. I don't necessarily, when I go to start making editing and cut, because I try to do everything all in one go. So like I'll write a draft all in one go and try not to go back, because then I feel like I lose the flow, like of the momentum of the present that I'm in. But once I do go back, I usually do find myself, if the romance works, if it does end up being an important part of the story, an important part of the character's journey, if anything, I do try to enhance that after the fact, to try to just show that, yes, there's a purpose for this. It's not just, hey, let's have a cool sex scene or whatever, like this is important to the character. It's important to her growth. So I want to make sure that that's reinforced.
So no just random romps for your character.
Yeah. If there's a romp, there's a reason.
Right.
When I'm editing, I just go through it and I don't look necessarily at the romance side to see what needs adjusting. If it needs adjusting, it needs adjusting, but then so do other elements of the book. So it's not just particularly the romance that I look at. The fantasy is a fantasy first and then a paranormal romance. This one is a MC romance, but this is probably the only book that's really into strong romance, because we have quite a dangerous love triangle. With the In Times of Violence, that is probably the only book out of the 13 that is really romance based, more than any of my other books.
So basically, since all of my books are romance, they're heavy on the romance, I sort of have to sometimes edit out scenes. A lot of the times when I'm writing, I'm a pantser, so I don't know where it's going to go, but I do know that there is going to be a lot of romance. So pretty much edit out a good chunk of it, because the story is so focused on love between the characters and stuff.
Is a lot of how you edit because you're towing the line with the romance? You don't want it to go toward the erotica kind of.
Exactly. Because I don't write erotica, I don't want to overdo it. When I'm writing, sometimes I'll have the first drafts will have a whole bunch of romantic scenes, and I'll have to, get rid of like 50% of it.
And I was going to say too, you really inspired me to think of something too. As a romance fan, I don't know, I think out of all the genres, romance, with their tropes, which are very important for romance in their marketing, right? The different classifications. It's also important for readers, because readers of romance, they go in and they know exactly what they want.
Mm-hmm.
You've got your crowd that wants the happy ever after. You've got your crowd that wants clean. You've got your crowd that wants erotica, or they like enemies to lovers, or they like second chance romance or billion, whatever. But they go in knowing what they want. So you have to make sure that whatever you're writing, you're delivering what fits the reader's expectations, because they want what they want, and that's it, and you better give it to them.
Exactly.
You know,
Correct.
the interesting thing about that, though, like for people like, who aren't romance fans, and I'm slowly becoming one because I'm starting to realize that there's much more depth than there really isn't. But a lot of people think that, and I'm guilty of it. I was guilty, and maybe it's because I'm a man, and maybe men have this perception a lot more. But the idea is like it's very shallow. It's very like fluffy and
Mhm.
ridiculous,
It used to be.
weird, and
some of it still is. I mean, it just
Yeah, some of it
depends.
is.
Mhm.
for you all who are storytellers with the romance, people do play up that. You're right. There are Harlequin writers and there are writers out there. But what would you tell somebody who isn't versed in that idea, who hasn't been subjected to that it's going to be part of what you're doing? How would you, even though you want to capture that romance audience, like you were saying, Jennifer, but you still want to capture people outside of that audience too. So
Mhm.
how do you do that balancing act?
Well, I would say, first off, I mean, as with any writing, it doesn't matter what the genre is or whatever. If you're writing like a story that's coming from an authentic place, the characters are relatable. There's plot elements that are going to pull people in, and it's the same thing with the romance. If you're writing an authentic romance where the people like the characters, the readers, they will go through anything if they're invested. So, like with writing horror with elements of romance can be challenging because it's not always the most popular inclusion in a horror story.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think that's sometimes because, no offense against male romance writers, but in the past, when men have done romance in horror and not done it very well, looking at you, Stephen King, sorry, I love you, but that already sets a bias against people. So if they see it starting, they'll be like, oh God, here we go, it's a romance, I didn't want this, I wanted horror. But if you make the characters relatable and there's a connection between the reader and them, they'll go through with it, and maybe even in the end they'll like it. Like in my Clementine's Awakening, I did have some people who were not happy there was a romance in it, but I also had some people who were like hardcore horror readers, and they loved Clementine so much that they were like, you know what? I normally hate romance, but I really was into this because I really felt a connection to her character. So if you're doing your job right, then it doesn't matter what you do. Like the romance will work if you set the groundwork.
I think it has a lot to do with the blurb and the genre, that before the reader buys the book, they're going to know from your blurb, from the genre of the book, whether they're going to be getting a romance. As I said, mine is this one is a clean romance, and it's classed as a young adult clean fantasy paranormal romance. Bit of a mouthful there. That is classed as a erotica, dystopian sci-fi erotica. So they know they're going to get that. Stone Cold is a supernatural young adult thriller. Is there a romance? No, there isn't. And why? Because it doesn't tell you in the genre there's a romance. Then there is Road Rage and Lawless Justice, which are MC thrillers. Again, MC thrillers, no romance. There is a romance in Road Rage, but it's not mentioned. It's mentioned in the blurb, but it's not mentioned in the genre because it's more of a MC thriller than it is romance. Romance takes a backseat again. But I think if you use the blurb and the genre, the correct genre, then the reader will know whether to expect a romance and not suddenly be
like Karina was saying, the genre kind of tells you in the blurb as well. Like mine all say, my paranormal romances all say reverse harem in the blurb, which kind of is bad for me because then Amazon's not going to let me promote. They don't promote that particular subgenre, but it helps readers who are looking for that because they can say, bing, here it is. This is what I want, or this is what I don't want. And it saves me the trouble of someone like, ew, there's like all this in here. I didn't want this. Why did I buy this book? And I was like, well, you see in the blurb, it's there. So that's your own fault.
You have to take some personal responsibility. Let's be honest. You can't go into if the book has a half naked person on it. and you don't expect there to be some kind of romance,
Mhm.
you're setting yourself up for disappointment, I think, a little bit.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
How about for you, Sydnie? You are a romance writer, so is there a little bit more that you play up or play down in order to, market what you're doing?
Basically, I play up the paranormal or the dystopian element to market. So even though the books are heavily romance, I do want other people that wouldn't normally read romance to read my books. So I try to, in the blurb as well, I try to, play up the sci-fi or the paranormal element.
Okay, so let's get into the elephants of the room here, and our favorite things about romance. First off, we had a conversation a couple weeks ago on This Week in Indies about trigger warnings, and I feel like romance is one of those genres that has to either adhere to that or has to find a way around it. And I'm curious what your thoughts are all on when you're putting something like this out, and that there's romance, especially maybe if there's a rape or something deep like that, something that is going to trigger something. How careful you are about all that.
I don't have the same triggers that a lot of people do. A lot of stuff that might trigger someone else, I just read over it and think, okay, that's part of the story, whatever. So I don't necessarily, I have trouble recognizing what might be a trigger to someone else, because to me, it's just part of a story.
Has anybody come to you and asked about the triggers?
No one's asked me about triggers, although my book Abnormal does have some scenes in it that can be triggering, because there's an attack in the early part of the book, and there's a few scenes that take place in a internment camp later on in the book, which are supposed to be triggering. But after talking to my publisher, we decided not to put any trigger warnings on, and no one's really said anything like negative about, oh, this should have been a trigger warning. More so, like, I almost couldn't get past X scene, but once I did, I loved it. So, I mean, that's hard for some people to get through. I don't know if it's really triggering, worthy of putting a warning on it. Yeah, I mean, I do put when there's graphic and it needs to be 18 plus, but that's about it.
I totally agree with you too, AJ. I feel the same way when I'm reading books. Like, I know what does trigger people. It does not usually trigger me because, again, I write it off as part of the story. However, I've been saying that my whole life, and then I finally, a couple years ago, I read The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum, which was a beautiful book, but it was seriously the most horrific, terrifying. I almost had to put it down a few times because now I know what people say when they mean triggered, because I was like, I couldn't get it out of my head. I felt scarred by it. But I think genre, like Karina was saying, genre and your marketing titles and all that sort of stuff, that should also really inform people a lot, to where I don't think most books should need like an official trigger warning, depending on, where you're going with it. Like if you're writing horror, you really know that something probably bad is going to happen. So you should know going in that there's going to be some unpleasantness. As far as romance, if you're typically writing like a lighter type of romance, but maybe you're going to throw in a rape scene or something, and your audience would not necessarily expect that, and you don't know if they, if someone would be upset by it. I mean, that might be an example where you might consider doing a trigger warning, because there's no other way that you might be able to inform them. They might not have a clue going in based on the other information about the book. So I think it really depends on a case-to-case basis.
Well, I do know what will trigger people. In my book, Such Exquisite Calamity, there deals with child sexual assault and cutting and drug abuse. So I actually am going to go back into edit my book just to add a trigger warning, because I know that mentions of those can bother people. When I've posted it online to market my book, I do market it with those things in mind. So I talk about like the character that does those things. I mentioned that he's neurodivergent. I mentioned that he's mentally ill. I mentioned that he's a child sexual abuse survivor, so that people know what they're getting into.
For romance, especially, you know, I think there might be some ridiculous notions about triggering, you know, oh, we saw her thigh. Oh, he touched her.
Yeah.
Her thigh. Oh my God. You know, it's like, but there's prudishness with a lot of that. I think that is not necessary. Right. So.
Yes.
If you're prude, just don't read just put it away now.
Yeah, exactly.
The hot books. But no, I mean that's a really good point too about, you know, people. I think we can all agree we've seen examples of people in this world that can be a little too overly sensitive. So I don't know what to tell people like that. It's like, I'm sorry, the world can be an ugly place and there can be bad things that happen. And that's just a fact of life. Regardless of fiction, we've all experienced stuff that's bad, like that we don't want to remember again. But in a way, that's the beauty of art, right? The best art gives us that catharsis to help us through. You know, you read a horror story, and maybe something abuse, you know, some horrible abuse happens and you were abused, and it's upsetting, you know, to read that because it does remind you, but then you see the character somehow overcome it, and that actually makes you feel better. So it's good, I think, you know, and there's a whole part of psychology about this, you know, flooding. If you've got phobias or stuff like that, I mean, eventually your therapist will work you to a point where you will have to face, in a safe space, through art, through a movie, through a book, you'll have to face that fear, and eventually it gets smaller. So I would say trigger warnings, I mean, again, case by case basis, they're not necessarily a bad thing, but I also encourage people not to shy away, because if the writer's doing their job right, if they're doing justice to the character, if they're not being gratuitous, you know, like a rape scene is not pleasant. You can deal with it though if it's done in a way that's not just some gross twisted fantasy or whatever. Like it's done in a helpful way.
I think an author that puts something in the middle of a soppy, feel-good, clean romance that shouldn't be there shouldn't have had that book published. For me, if you're reading something and you get triggered by it because it wasn't supposed to be in there, no one expected something like that to happen in that book, then that's on the author. I write everything from young adult to clean romance to erotica to really dark romance, and Joe knows the kind of thing. And but my books sort of tell the reader what they're going to get from the cover, from the blurb, from the reviews as well, of course. So if you don't want to read it, don't read it. But to have something trigger you in a romance book that shouldn't be there, then that's on the author.
I want to know what really makes you mad about the misconceptions of romance. What are you looking at and going, you know what, that's ridiculous, that's not what this is? You know, is there certain tropes or certain ideas that people have misconceptions?
A lot of people think that there's no plot. People just think that it's like random sex scenes and, you know, there's no story going on, which really bothers me because I work really hard to build the story, you know, to work on the characters and their backstories and everything. And I don't like that being dismissed.
When you think paranormal romance, they automatically think of vampires, werewolves, and ghosts and anything supernatural. When in fact, in my paranormal romance, there's none of that. My paranormal romance is called paranormal romance because she has powers, and she has an evil living inside of her that tries to take over her soul, and that's what makes it paranormal romance. But yeah, as soon as people think paranormal romance, they think Twilight, they think True Blood, and you know, stuff like that. It's straight away werewolves, vampires.
Sydnie really put it down. A lot of people assume if it's romance, it doesn't have a plot. And like my Hell on Earth trilogy, it doesn't sound like romance when you hear Hell on Earth, but that's basically what it is. You know, it's about these characters and their guys that they're with, and the relationships and how they deal with this Hell on Earth phenomena that's happening, that they, because of their paranormal powers, are involved in. Yeah, there's, you know, hot scenes going on, and there's, you know, stuff happening, but it's all it's not just there for the sake of being there. You know, there's reasons for it, and it's all characters connecting and everything. It's not just bang, 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 you know. I mean, it could be depending on who's writing, but I mean, mine, you know, there's a whole overarching theme to what's going on in this trilogy. So it's not just the characters hooking up.
And for me, when I hear Hell on Earth and it's a romance, as a newly divorced person,
Oh, I was going to say, again, I think it depends on, like everyone else was saying, it depends on the writer and what they're doing with the story. Because if it's a good story, it doesn't matter what it's about. It doesn't matter the genre, because you're going to buy into it. You're going to love it. But I think, you know, people have their preconceptions and it can be frustrating. Like sitting to watch any movie with my boyfriend. I love him. He's a great guy. But the minute that there's anything in the movie, a kiss, some like sort of spark of romance, he's like, oh, boring, done. I'm done with it. I'm like, what are you talking about? Not every romance in every movie is boring and stupid. Some of them, no matter what the genre, they can be action films, they can be horror films, they can be whatever films. If it's done right, it's still enjoyable. Now, if it's done bad, yeah, it's like getting your teeth pulled watching it on the screen. I totally agree. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place. That doesn't mean that everyone who writes about it sucks, like that it's bad. You're just reading the wrong thing.
In terms of writing, in the process of writing romance and things of that nature, I don't want to make this personal, you know, and say, hey, are you drawing from experience kind of idea and things like that. But because we're all skilled enough to know that there's a little bit of that, but there's also a lot of imagination that goes along with this as well. But I'm curious with your process in are you writing those particular scenes or that particular moment or that particular part of the book differently than you write everything else? Or are you feeling like the flow is always the same no matter what you're writing about and how you're writing?
I think in any high emotional moment in a book, it doesn't have to be romance. I mean, there's interactions your characters will go through that, you know, move them or scare them or something, really shake them up. And I think that anytime we're writing that kind of emotion, yeah, I mean, we're drawing a little bit from experience. You know, we've all been in love, or if nothing else, we've yearned for someone or lusted or whatever. So you do put a little bit of that in there, just like you do with anything your character does. But it is a lot of imagination too. I mean, I've never slayed a dragon or set someone on fire. I might do it in a book. So I'm kind of winging it as far as what you're supposed to feel. But I've felt grief, I felt love, I felt loss. So all of that kind of, you know, has its role in actions like that too. So it's definitely a blend, but it's mostly imagination for sure.
I think all writers put a bit of themselves in every book they write, whether it's romance or horror or whatever. But with romance, it goes with experience, it goes with research, good research, and experiences that you've had from your first kiss right through to walking down the aisle with your husband. I think a lot of books that you read, a lot of films that you've seen, it all adds up to how you write this romance in your book. Imagination, I think that'll be difficult to use your imagination for a romance, because at the age that we are, us now on the panel, I think we've been through some stuff, so we know how we would deal with that scene.
A lot of mine is imagination, I'm just going to say, because I've written menage and reverse harem, and that is not what I've experienced, so I'm just making stuff up there, just throwing that out there.
But to Karina's point, it's probably based on stuff you've seen before, right?
Well, I mean, you know, a little creative Google searching, sure, you can find stuff, but you know, clear your history.
That might be the worst rabbit hole to go down in the history of rabbit holes, right there. I'm not sure.
You might not want to Google rabbit hole. I mean, I'm just saying, you never know what you're going to find.
No.